Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. We are one panelist lacking. He will be on. He's on his way. He's en route. But before then, I want to just take the opportunity to welcome you to our first Hill briefing with the National Alliance of Public Charter Schools in association and in conjunction with the National Charter Collaborative, Diverse Charter Schools Coalition, and the Freedom Coalition for Charter Schools. And so we are talking about self-determination, why leaders of color choose this model of charter schools to deliver good education for their communities as representatives of their communities and having the best knowledge about what kids need to see in the classroom and at the leadership of schools in order to replicate success that they see before them. We have a saying in my fraternity, you cannot be me unless you see me. And that's what you all do as leaders that are here, and that's what these panelists do each and every day. And so as in conjunction with our 8th annual Charter School Leaders of Color Advocacy fly-in, we welcome you, and we're happy to talk about the issues that matter the most about charter schools. We decided to have this Hill briefing because oftentimes when we talk about charter schools under the lens of who leads them and for what purpose, the leader of color is oftentimes not included in the mix, or we don't think of leaders of color coming from communities to educate kids who look like them in their communities. And we're here to make that message very loud and clear to members of Congress, to staffs of members of Congress, that that is indeed the average testimony of folks that are in this work and have made this their life mission. Two quick stats that I want to leave with you before I introduce the moderator, and that is 33% of school leaders within the charter school movement are leaders of color, juxtaposed to traditional district schools who have upwards of 19% of their leaders being leaders of color. If for no other reason than that, charter schools ought to be supported and actually replicated and expanded just because of that number alone. The second number I want to let you know is that we're in the end of Black History Month, but that kids that are in charter schools that are led by an African American, it's 50% higher that they will have a leader of color than their traditional district school counterparts. Some of you who were at the beginning of our discussion today heard that number. And again, for that reason alone, if that was the only reason, the only thing that charter schools did, it'd be a reason enough to support the proliferation and the expansion of charter schools. But enough with the soapbox. Let me introduce our moderator for this esteemed panel of participants and leaders, Jay Artis-Wright, who is the Executive Director of the Freedom Coalition for Charter Schools. So Jay and I go back personally. Jay is a New Jerseyite, a Newarker, somebody who has not only serving as the executive director of the Freedom Coalition for Charter Schools, she has somebody who actually started a charter school within Newark, right? In Plainfield. In Plainfield. I'm sorry, she's Jersey. That's close enough. Plainfield is close enough. But before leading the Freedom Coalition, she was the executive director of Parent Revolution, a parent-based advocacy organization, and vice president of policy and public affairs for the California Charter Schools Association. From leading policy initiatives focused on educational equity, teacher diversity, and school funding, to building outreach strategies for education-based legal challenges, Jay's multifaceted career also includes training advocates on organizing and diversity, equity, and inclusion. She has successfully secured policy wins for charter schools and coached parents and teachers running for local school board. She is a dedicated worker in this field with a plethora of experience, not only on the education side, but in the advocating side and parent engagement side, and engaging with students and empowering student voices. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this esteemed panel, Jay Artis-Wright. Jay?
Thank you. Can y'all hear me okay like this? Because I am normally really loud, so I don't need a microphone, but I want to make sure that we have enough space. So, is he coming? Okay. Well, Ron, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I was more than excited to be a part of this 8th annual Day on the Hill, specifically for charter school leaders of color, because this has been a huge part of my life work coming into this space, primarily for what Ron has already mentioned, the fact that charter school leaders of color make up the 33% of school leaders across this country, but also more so that we have over 69% of students of color in our charter schools. And so it is my mission and the mission of my organization to continue to make sure that we are amplifying and advocating for more charter school leaders of color so that ethnicity and identity can also match the students that we serve, which is also really a valuable point when we have these conversations in these spaces. I am so excited to be here with these members. I'm so excited to be here with you and excited to have our legislative staff here to get an opportunity to hear the other side of the charter school movement. That is the side where Black and Brown and Indigenous and Asian and all other populations get to come together. Everyone except for the non-melanated white man that y'all see that pretty much has been said to be the narrator and leading the narrative around charter schools. We've existed for a long time. There are charter school leaders in this space that are 20 years old. And so it's important that in today's conversation, we continue to bring that up, that this is not a nuance for any of us, that we have been here for a very long time. As parents, as charter school leaders, as educators, this is our space, and we need to be heard more often. We know, if you've been doing this work, that the majority of times we keep our heads down. We're more worried about making sure that our kids are educated. But this day, and days like this, are days for us to pick our heads up and put our shoulders back and really be able to share why this work is so valuable and why we need to keep doing this work. So with no further ado, I am going to introduce let our panel introduce themselves and give our last panel member a chance to join. But yeah, so let's go ahead. Starting to my left, if you could introduce yourself, your school affiliation, and how long you guys have been around.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Amber Leon-Guerrero, and I am from DreamHouse Ava Beach Public Charter School that is located in Kapolei, Hawaii, and we've been around since 2019.
Ricardo Mireles. I'm the executive director and founder for Academia Avance in Los Angeles. I'm also a founding board member of the Freedom Coalition for Charter Schools. It's part of the group putting this together.
How long have you guys been around?
Our school started in 2005, and I've been in charter education for 20 years.
My name's Christina Perry. I work with an organization. I'm wearing two hats. One hat, organization called the BLACC Latinx Asian Charter Collaborative. So we work to elevate the narratives of charter school leaders of color across the state of New York. I'm also an aspiring school founder, charter school founder. Our school was approved, Quenda Collegiate Girls, to open in my neighborhood where I live in Flatbush, Brooklyn. But New York has a charter school cap. So even though we had 300 parents say, we want this for our girls, we legally can't open until that cap is lifted. I'm so excited to be part of this conversation today.
Thank you so much for sharing. And so let's just jump right in. Ron or someone, please cue me if Sekou comes in. We talked about the fact that we're here, why we're here. Just a quick question, and this is one that I'm gonna, popcorn it, and any of you guys can answer, or you can just say, I'll take that one. But this one, how do charter schools fit in the larger context of K through 12 systems, and why is our presence so important? Anyone? Any of y'all could take that one.
Part of one of the great advantages of the charter law, which is different in every state, but is that there's no such thing as one charter template or even a handful of templates. It's unique as it's expressed in each interpretation, in each iteration, right? So this is a new school, they're gonna fit it to their 300 families, right? Very different from the school in Hawaii. And earlier you talked about how what works on the mainland probably doesn't work on the island. Right, and so the power of the charter school is to make it fit, right? And so the terms that have already been used, self-determination, right? This is a community that says, you know what, we need this, and need then interprets, this is how we define what that need is, and how we define what that solution is, right? And so the self-determination, but also in that solution, that it has cultural relevancy, right? That it fits the people that it's working. And so I wanted to make sure that in my answers I put stories. So I'm going to put some stories in here, right? So Avance, as an example, our board, our administration, our staffing is all 80% Latino, right? And so for a community that we serve only 98% Latino kids, they fit. That fits, right? Another big component for our school is immigration status and the challenges that it represents. In 2017, ICE, under a new administration, went against families. They went against our families, right? And so there was a father taking his 2 daughters to school. That was an Avance father, right, who was detained by ICE. He was detained by 6 months, for 6 months. We were here in D.C. advocating for him, so that it became a huge, important moment for the school, and not just for that family, to be able to tell all the other families that suddenly went into fear. The day after the election in 2016, we had 2 young women who had recently come from Guatemala. They just up and ran away. Just said, we can't handle this, we gotta go. That's how impactful it was for people to really take matters to an extreme extent. So we had this father that was detained in 2017. In 2019, we had another father also detained by ICE. He was released in 2 months. And that seems like a long time ago, but we had a father detained 2 months ago, right? And so this reality is still there. Can we have an entity to support these families? Why not make it schools, right? So I think that, to your question of how can charter schools fit, they fit by defining the need in a way that is much broader, and they find solutions that are much more deeper and relevant.
Thank you. Amber or Christina, you guys want to add on to that at all, or?
Yeah, I think I would echo Ricardo in that, charter schools by design were meant to be hyper-local, like to be responsive to community needs, right? So I think about kind of my own upbringing. I grew up in Virginia, and it was the most segregated town by census in the state. And so one side of, ironically, Martin Luther King Jr. Bridge was all the Black people who I went to church with. And my family lived on the other side of Martin Luther King Jr. Bridge. And we were lucky enough to make just enough money to rent a house in that school district, right? And so my high school, not hyperbole, top 2% of the state in terms of achievement scores. And everyone that looks like me across the bridge, bottom 2% of the state, right? The only option my parents had was renting a house in another district where no one looked like us. And that was it. And charter schools disrupt that. They give parents of color the chance and the opportunity to send their kid where they think is best. And I can't think of a more powerful lever that we have in terms of community empowerment than the right to choose where your child goes to school and the outcomes that you want for them.
That is very powerful. And Amber, do you want to share a little bit more what you were sharing about your story of invisibility? And
Yeah, so, when we talk about responding to community needs, coming from a Native Hawaiian background, listening to your people and also listening to the keiki that you serve is really crucial to develop that pilina, that relationship that you have with them, so that way you can come up with solutions and understand the true need of why, it is important to have another charter school within that community. If you look at the Leeward Coast in Hawaii, housing development is real. So that means a lot of overcrowded of students and enrollment is happening within the traditional public schools. And you have a lot of parents, going back to the choice to recognize and the choice to also choose a school that is best fit for your child is extremely important. And when you want to talk about like cultural relevancy or competency, charter schools have that power and that leverage to design from scratch, to focus on other things other than just that academic. And that's what we, at DreamHouse of a Beach Public Charter School, really focus on the identity and the development and leadership for the students that we serve.
thank you. Thanks so much. And I would be remiss if I didn't add that charter schools have a 30-year history in this country, and it started, as a pilot project specifically to find teachers and parents and educate and community members who were looking for a way to get Black and brown students in high-performing schools. That was the initial charter, right? And so, to look at that 30 years ago and to see where we are now, I think that we should all be cognizant of that history, because it makes a difference when we, as representatives here, show up, because this is who we were. I mean, to be synonymous with being a Black and brown-led school period, public school period, and be successful is what we're aiming for. Because historically, what we've seen is that if you are Black and brown, Latino, Asian, across the board, if you're not represented, you're typically in a low-performing school, a low-performing public school, and that is not why we exist. Charter schools will exist specifically to combat that and to change that, and I think that it's working, and that's what we need to continue to do. So I just wanted to add to that, because that's just how I roll sometimes, so y'all just gotta roll with me. Oh, go ahead.
As I'm hearing our answers, this came to me, and that in the current public debate about public education, there's a lot of, in terms of the word choice, right? And that we want to give parents choice. This isn't just semantics, though. In the Freedom Coalition for Charter Schools, which was a call to action in 2019 by Dr. Howard Fuller, one of the founding board members of the National Alliance, he made it very clear this needs to be an organization that's led by Black and brown people for self-determination, right? And here's the difference. In self-determination, people are making a choice, but they're also making a choice of how to solve the problem, right? And so here's the story that came to mind, right? Our neighborhood in Los Angeles is right on the edge. On one side, it's South Pasadena. Right now, South Pasadena is it's similar to your story about the other side of that boundary. And I used to say that's where they had $1 million homes. Actually, they're $2 million homes, right? Because pricing has really gone up. But there was a study that was done in the Los Angeles Times about how are Latino students doing in South Pass, right? And they're graduating and they're going to college, but 75% of them were going to Pasadena City College, to the community college, the 2-year school. Okay, now I don't want to throw too much shade on the 2-year degree part of that, but there is a difference, right? Now, our school, little chance to put a flag up here, our school is in the top 10% in terms of the number of students that we get to enroll in college, and this is a state statistic. It's not ours, it's a state statistic, right? And so you could say, how many are prepared? How about how many are actually enrolled? How many are going to college? And the majority of those students are going to a 4-year school, not a 2-year school, right? And so going to my original point, choice is, well, some families have the option to be able to go buy a $2 million home. Actually, many don't, right? But coming to a school, a charter school like Avance, or like the schools that many people here are leading, is one where what more, not just I'm going to join that solution, but what's our solution? Right, and in this case, we're doing better than those homes, those folks that are in South Pasadena. It's just like 2 miles over.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. And we've now been joined with our other panelists. I want to give him a chance to introduce himself and settle in really quickly. But it's really critical that you're here, so thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
So if you could just tell us who you are, what affiliation you represent, and why you're here.
Sure thing. My name is Sekou Biddle. I'm Vice President for K-12 Advocacy at UNCF. And I think principally the reason I'm here is, in addition to the fact that we have a vital interest in increasing the numbers of, in particular, students of color that are going to college and are going to college ready, we are actually now embarking on some work on our own to partner with HBCUs for them to be more intentional about partnering with the K-12 pipeline, including direct partnerships with existing schools and establishing new and innovative, probably high schools, but also all forms of K through 12 that will get more students both inspired to consider and be on the path to college, but also prepared to get to college and be successful.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, Sekou, and thank you for that insight. And I have a specific question for you. Before I go there, Christina, I actually wanted you to share a little bit more because you had mentioned that your school was not able to open because of the cap. And if any of y'all have been following the news lately, the New York Post just recently was posting articles about potentially lifting that cap. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that a lot of that work has been spearheaded by BLACC, the organization that you represent. But if you could just speak to us, like, what is the problem with the cap in New York, and how does it specifically impact schools like the one you're trying to open?
For sure, thank you. So New York, like a couple of other states across the country, has a limit on how many charter schools can exist in the state. And they have a smaller limit on how many can exist in New York City. So New York City hit that cap in 2019. And right now, there's about 13 schools on a wait list. By no mistake, 10 of those 13 schools are led by people of color, or would be led by people of color. And New York is not a shining star of equity, racial equity in the charter space. About 91% of kiddos that go to public charter schools in our state are kids of color. Only about 8% of schools are founded and led by leaders of color, right? So when we think about this wait list and we think about who it impacts, it is communities of color. I will never forget us getting the call about we were approved, and our authorizer is actually nationally recognized for how rigorous their application is. Most applicants do not get approved their first time around. And we had all of these parents who were wanting this school. Just to give some context for our school and our neighborhood. So Brooklyn's the most populous borough in New York City. Right now, there's one public K-8 girls' school in the whole borough. Meanwhile, New York City is home to some of the most world-renowned private girls' schools that have tuition upwards of $40,000 a year. So our school, the genesis came to be at a community gun violence meeting where there were all these pastors talking about the importance of curbing gun violence in Flatbush, and there was no mention of girls, right? There was no mention of the impact of gun trafficking and human trafficking, right? And so a bunch of moms, most of them my neighbors, said, we want to create a space that's centered on Black girls and keeping them safe and making sure they feel seen and that they're not completely rendered invisible in policy conversations, right? So we've got this surge of parent support. There's a press release saying we're approved. I have a mom calling me saying, okay, so I can send my 6-year-old in a year to the school. And I was like, no, we can't. And she said, well, we're approved. And I said, yeah, but we have a charter cap. And explained the law, and she said, why can't we open? And I said, it's this law. We have a law that says this arbitrary number of schools can be open, and once we hit that number, nothing else matters, right? Nothing else can open. And so for her, it didn't make much sense. And for all of our parents on our list, it didn't make much sense. And that's the story we're trying to tell in Albany, that yes, X amount of years ago, when this arbitrary number was set, likely in partnership with the reigning teachers' unions, you made that number. But there are parents of color now who want different outcomes for their kids, right? And the tangible human impact, even just for our school, so about 2/3 of girls of color in the New York City DOE report being sexually harassed at school. At school. So when we set out to open our school, our parents, they're 5 or 6-year-olds, right? Girls. Fast forward 4 years, we're still on the wait list. I have parents calling me now that their 9-year-old, 10-year-old is being sexually harassed at school. And yet, because we have this law, our school can't open for families, right? So it is tangible impact. It is more than just policy. And that's why this work is so important, because I think elected officials are surprised that schools like ours, led by people of color with real authentic ties to the community, exist, and we need to amplify those voices.
Thank you so much. And Sekou, I really want to get you into this conversation because UNCF is kind of coming into this work fairly new, and a lot of it has been based off of partnerships with HBCUs. Can you share with us a little bit more about what that partnership looks like and why was it important to do that now?
Yeah. Well, I think going backwards, why it's important to do it now. I mean, sort of the old saw of like, you know, the best time to have done something was probably 10 years ago, and the second best time is now. You know, I think for us, there are a few things that make it really important and strategic. One of those is that, you know, for more than 150 years, HBCUs have been doing what they've been doing to sort of promote success, in particular for African American and Black people in this country, and you know, have been really swimming upstream against lack of opportunity, lack of educational equity that's available for them. And even in those conditions, helping young people find career success. And then, you know, we see the degree to which HBCU graduates, you know, sort of overweight toward leadership in their communities. And these schools have been doing this for a long time in this country. UNCF has been supporting HBCUs now for over 78 years. And what we have seen is, as opportunities to go to colleges, because keep in mind, you know, historically, many of the students who were attending HBCUs, you know, 100 years ago, that was the only opportunity they had for post-secondary education. That's obviously changed, and that's, I think, you know, obviously a really good thing for our country. What hasn't changed is that the K through 12 pipeline hasn't strengthened to make sure that more young people are college ready, A, and B, like, actually know what they would need to do to get ready to go to college. And this is, you know, very present for me because I've got like one son who just graduated from college and one who is graduating from high school this year going to college. And it's clear that there's a lot that doesn't happen in K through 12 simply to put students on the path so that they get to choose. And one of the things I learned, you know, as a classroom teacher is that, you know, a lot of what's going on, I think the points Christina made about, you know, children not being served well, is that oftentimes, like, schools are making decisions for children about, like, what their opportunities are going to be. And those decisions tend to, like, really tightly correlate to how poor the children are or how Black or brown they are. Like, the poorer and the Blacker you are, the less the schools tend to see you as your college material. And then you don't learn simply the what needs to happen to go to college, nor do you get the college preparatory education. And so for our institutions, like that, you know, obviously require having more and more college-ready students, it's in their strategic benefit to work with actors in the K-12 world to help more students be exposed to college, understand how it's right for them, and to know how to go, and then actually be academically prepared for college success, because there's much less of that happening, in particular for African American students, than we would like to see. And, you know, with institutions that have 150 plus years of success of helping African Americans succeed academically, I think we have a strong belief that a lot of what they're doing in post-secondary, if we can bring that into K through 12, will help many more young people succeed.
Thank you so much. And Ricardo, I wanted to jump in here as well, because I know that you recently had a meeting with Unidos US. If you could share a little bit more about your thoughts around that and kind of what's happening on the Latino side of things.
I did want to jump in on that comment and allow me to start just on one part, which is about, you said schools making choices for kids. Right? And imagine that, I mean, I had a conversation yesterday with a young man who talked about, he wants to be a lawyer, right? And I'm sure you've heard this one, right? But does this young man have any experiences in a law firm? Right? So we want kids to make decisions that are actually big dollar decisions, right? Your choice in career and your choice in college it go together, right? And so, and there's college debt, right? So and then forget about the money. There's just the time, right? The 4, 5, 6 years in this young person's life where they're making a choice out of high school and now they're going, right? And based on what, right? Why can't we get these kids to have more real experiences before they're 18, before they graduate, so that when they choose to go, right, they actually have something that it's based on, right? So there's some opportunities to do that in terms of career technical education. There's some more recent, this administration is talking about that. I think it might take still a while. Our school's been doing it now for a dozen years, where our seniors do an internship program, right? And we were able to partner with Unidos US, so this organization, that's the biggest organization representing Latinos nationally, to help us structure our career technical education with a program that they have. Right? So that kind of segues into, I think, where you were getting at. But just to make that point, you talk about preparing them for college, not just the academic part, but also the why. Why are you going? The purpose part. And so much of that relates to persistence, right? And so the biggest drop-off rate is actually after the first year in college, right? We're like, why am I doing this? And kids struggling. That's where we really need to give them the why, right? So in terms of Unidos, they've been able to help a lot of charter schools tune their program for the Latino community. So what is the impact to the Latino community? And I spoke a little bit before in terms of the cultural relevancy of it, right? But in terms of, I mean, I thought I had these words written down here, Jay, to focus on. And how has a community, when you said, Ron, when you said to be me, you have to see me, right? And to understand, and this is an evolving self-perception that communities have over many decades, right? So I remember when they invented the term Hispanic from the U.S. Census, right? Like, I guess that's what they want to call us. I don't know. That doesn't fit, right? But then the Latino community said, no, we want to be Latino, okay? Now, I first learned, and you got to learn from youth, right? I first learned from a young woman who in university in Austin in 2015. She kind of looked at me like, you don't know what Latinx is? You don't know? And I go, well, I learned fast, right? and what I'm really excited is I learned a new term from another young brother recently. This is Latinx, right? So you can say Latinx, but nosotros somos Latinx. I'm like, oh, okay, now that one, that fits.
That fit nice. Huh?
That fit nice. But it also gets to an understanding of just what is the role of education that I use with our parents, right? And so, especially here in Washington, education policy talk will be about what is the well-educated child, right? And you're talking about preparing the student for college, well-educated, and we can envision, that young person over there has good diction and excellent math skills and an expansive vocabulary, right? But cuando mi abuelita hablaba, right? When my grandmother said, "Qué tan bien educado aquel joven," right? Now it's semantically almost the same. Well-educated, bien educado, very different. Bien educado almost has nothing to do with math or vocabulary English, right? The grandma just sitting there on the side of the room could tell in an instant. It's the kid who walked in and said hi to everybody in the room, right? It's the kid that when something spilled, picked it up, right? It's the kid who was ready to help, right? The Boy Scout mentality, right? Now, how can we code switch that over? And the best way is that's the kid who's a professional. That's the kid who's a team player. That's the kid who has the can-do spirit, right? And guess what? You said it. When you go to college, that's what you need to succeed, more than some SAT scores, right? And do we teach that in schools now? No, but we can. There's nothing preventing, right? And so charter schools do. Many of your schools do get to those non-cognitive skill sets, right? So it fits for us. And I'll go back to the first thing, is the leaders here are able to adjust from other traditions what works in their community to make sure that kids are ready. And right now it is, to pick of many goals, but making sure that students are able to not just get into college, but finish and actually get a degree and be successful citizens.
Thank you so much for sharing that, y'all. So I want to get into this other conversation, and I think this comes up a lot when we are advocating on behalf of charter schools, and I find it's happened all of the time. So I want to see if you guys can talk us through it and actually give some of our other charter school leaders potentially some talking points. And it's this conversation around accountability. Everybody's like nodding their head like, yep. Yeah, because it's like you get this conversation and you go into a room and the first thing, usually a young legislative staffer will say was, well, what does your accountability metrics look like? And I think that it's really interesting that we talk about that. One, because we know accountability is built into our charter, but also just from the framework of how do you show accountability in your schools, especially within your enrollment when you know you're enrolling, predominantly Latino and African American or minority students across the board that are coming to your school because their local traditional school probably wasn't successful for them. So can you speak to, and any of you guys could take this, Ricardo, you've been here for 19 years, so we probably throw this back to you, but like the accountability, can you speak to that a little bit, and how do you answer that question about how is your school held accountable, or how do you hold charter schools accountable? Sure, go ahead.
Okay, I anticipated a version of that question, right? And like I said, I wanted to tell it in terms of actual stories, right? So it's unfortunate, and mostly this is talking about California because the law is different in every state, and then within Los Angeles, which is specifically egregious. And partly they passed the law in 2019. AB 1505, and this was going to finally upgrade a 25-year-old state law about charter schools and set some rules. Now, to this date, they still haven't been able to define what those rules are. COVID had something to do with that, but there's some issue there about what's the real intent in terms of setting those rules. But I want to state that there's this whole debate about verifiable data, right? They have the state test. Every state has their version of their test data. In California, it's called CASP. Used to be called STAR. There's an issue here right now in terms of being able to use that data because COVID, right? So we'll see when that comes up. But there are other data systems that people have access to, national ones. The NWEA, for example, is one that we use. But I wanted to tell the story in terms of 3 students, right? And this is current. These are students right now that are seniors, and partly the reason I picked them is because they were here on Capitol Hill the week before last, right? So we brought them up here as part of the Unidos event. They were able to tell their story, right? So we have one student, and I was looking for the way to work in this quote. Here it is, right? Cornell West, right? Something, justice is how love is expressed in public. That's what the justice system is. And I would add, for this context, so is public education. How we educate our kids is how we express how we want to love our future citizens. Right? So how are we doing that? The school that this student was in, and I get it, post-Uvalde, we have to be really tight about what we're doing in terms of guns and violence, right? There's some leaders here that I was able to go to Uvalde. We went to the town. We were there, and it was is a very hurt place. And I'm a Tejano, okay? That's a really hurt place. But what can we do I get it when, all right, if there's something like a gun-related situation, you got to take a very extreme line, right? But don't just kick the student out with no supports. Right? So that's what happened this last November, right? Fortunately, this student had another family member that was at our school. So they came, what can we do? Like, we'll work it out. We'll look into this, right? She was accepted to Cal State Northridge last week, right? 16-year-old, super junior. Not only did we get this student graduated from high school, we also realized, you know what? There's still time to get you into the state university system. Got her in, did all the supports. She's now been accepted. And because of that, it's changing the whole perception from the city attorney's office, like, wait a minute, do we really want a felony charge in this situation? I mean, is that? And then we discovered that actually the administrators from the other school had actually recommended not to expel this student, right? Well, that would have been good to know last November before you possibly disrupted the student's life. So that's one story, right? Also with that student was a student who came to this country from Guatemala 5 years ago, right? And we learned here the harrowing story of crossing the border. I mean, it's just how extreme that at one point they literally threw one of the 4 kids into the river. Like, this is our best chance. Threw the kid in the river, right, to get across. They did all get across. Right? But the point is, this student then, you show up at a country where you don't know anything, right? She signed up for the regular local school there, and she quickly realized this isn't working out, right? Student is now with us. Student has been accepted already to 3 universities. She's graduating this June, right? Spoke no English when she got here. She's on her way. Cal Poly Pomona is one of the choices, right? So, and she will tell you it was the relationships that I felt seen. I felt seen. And so they understood what I needed to prepare for where I wanted to go. Right? Third student. This student, really, really difficult family situation. Drugs, the whole setup. Not a surprise. Traditional school system had him as an IEP. You've all seen that. Well, this kid exited from the IEP system. Junior year in high school, has now been accepted to 3 universities. This June is on her way. Right. So here's just 3 stories, and I only picked them because they were here last week, of families that they went a long ways to change their trajectory, but they needed a huge amount of support. Right? And in each of these 3 cases, the traditional school systems were not doing it. They were not doing it. They were able to find it in a charter school, and now they're on their way.
Well, thanks so much for sharing those stories, and I do think that stories are definitely relevant because they bring they humanize what we're going through, just as far as being leaders. I have another question, and this one is about what we're hearing a lot as we talk about the education landscape. How do leaders of color combat this anti-CRT, this anti-woke movement that is gaining national attention? How do you respond to that in your own communities and your own efforts to talk about education and the need for it? And Sekou, I'll start with you.
All right. Trying to flip a switch so I don't say something out loud. It's an interesting question because, so full disclosure, right? So I grew up here in D.C., went to D.C. public schools from a different era, mostly black teachers, went to Morehouse, and, learned a lot about it, and parents came from the civil rights movement, so had a lot of perspective on how we got here as a country and the conditions. I think what was eye-opening for me about what went on in 2020 was it was a real recognition that, most of America has no idea. There were a lot of things, and I think this is challenging for a lot of people of color, and in particular leaders of color, where the things we were taught that helped build a firm foundation for us and our communities about the way the world actually is and what we need to do to be successful in it are necessary to help children of color be successful. It's hard for me to see a world in which our children can succeed without an active working knowledge of exactly what really happened that got us to this place and this point based on the truth. And then, you pick how you're gonna go forward, but without knowing how we got here, you'll fall for all kind of explanations or why this is okay. So I think, the challenge is, we got to call things what they are. History is history. These things happened. And there's not because I've heard stuff well, there's another version of history. I'm like, no. There's history. Then there's some other story you want to tell. And I think that we have to push back pretty hard on what children need to know, in particular about themselves, their community, the places in which they came from, so that they can really know who they are, what they come from, where they come from, and then be informed and be emboldened to choose a path going forward. And and I say that in part because that I think is one of the principal building blocks for HBCUs and how they supported students over the years. It's a real study in, we realize that in a lot of places these students aren't really learning the true story of themselves and their community and their ancestry. And we're going to solve for that so that we can build strong leaders going forward. And I think it's necessary and important for, in U.S. is leaders, right, of color to do that. Now, I think some people are going to pull back and be I don't want that fight. But I think if, we're at a challenging moment, right? Because if we're not being honest about what our children need to know, and I think we can be like honest and we can be fair. Like, first of all children benefit from actually knowing this, and so I just don't believe in this notion that telling everybody the truth is going to somehow leave some portion of the group with hurt feelings, and that's going to prevent them from going forward. It just, no. Are there some hard things about the past that we need to know? Yes, there are. But I think that's a necessary part of growth, and I think it's important. And I think I've been in a lot of K through 12 schools throughout my career, and my own children. I've never seen where children are harmed by knowing more, right? I've seen how they've harmed by knowing less by a lot. But it is a challenge, and I think that it's a challenge because in some ways, and you don't want to push people into this fight. It's hard for me to actually that any of this debate is actually about education, right? It is and it just looks on its face like it's just a brazen attempt to just continue to peel people off and make people believe that there's some boogeyman out there that's gonna take something from them, instead of how about we get to a more equitable and more honest place. But I also recognize it is hard. Yeah. Thanks for pulling me into that, though.
Yeah. Well, you're off the hot seat, but I definitely want to get some other opinions. And Amber, in our last session, you had shared some things that I really would love for you to expound upon, and that was this invisibility. I mean, you talked about learning education from the mainland as opposed to learning your education in Hawaii. So can you share a little bit more about that and how it's relatable to this conversation?
Yeah, so, So I think, I just wanted to add to that. I mean, it's not really all about representation or allowing your students to truly know the real history, right? I think for us to, just speaking from that Islander perspective, it's also about educating the professionals that are coming here to our islands to also teach, right? And they too have to know the historical context of the land and exactly, know exactly what our people had suffered. Because if you're servicing them, you've got to, like I said, it goes down to making connections, and that is one thing that Islanders always have in common, is making connections with their teachers or kumus. And so, when we look at culturally responsive teaching at DreamHouse of a Beach, we actually allow our coaches, we call them coaches, and instructional designers to develop from scratch. And I think that right there, when you start to put relationships at the center of the core, especially when you are designing for the people that you are serving, you not only are understanding the ways and views of the Hawaii life or our ancestry life, but you're also understanding and recognizing that the keiki or the children that you are serving, they do come from historical trauma that our people have suffered from. And I think that right there, adding to and where we're truly focused on is allowing our instructional leaders to actually, take a tour of our island, understand, what really happened here in Honouliuli and who amongst our population had to be pushed out because of gentrification. And so, for us there, I think, again, it just comes down to critically thinking and also allowing not only our students, but also our coaches to know and to understand why and how our people are suffering and why are we here today to change that. I kind of want to add on too, when it does come to talking about culturally responsive pedagogy or even teaching, Black history, or even how our Hawaiian people have suffered. I've had Native Hawaiians that were not comfortable with us teaching these types of curriculum to their child. And so from there, I had to understand the why. Why are you opting out? You chose a charter school because you chose something different. But now you're telling me that you want to opt out from learning about what truly happened here in Hawaii, here in America. Help me understand. And what it came down to is I do not know how to have these conversations with my children. And that's important, right? Because again, we're so focused on the keiki or our kids, but what about the people around them? And that's, I believe, how we're doing things.
I love it when people ask me about, if the work we're doing is woke, if we're teaching CRT to 3-year-olds. And I think as school leaders, we really have to be emboldened in pushing back, right? Like, you act like Black people in this country want something super radical. We want to trust that when we drop our kids off at school, they'll be safe and they'll learn to read. That's not radical. That they'll learn where we came from. That, I think this whole debate about woke or not woke, it's rooted in white supremacy, right? Like, that somehow telling our history and our story is divisive. It's hurtful, right? Like, that's not it. We are here to celebrate American history and to ensure that our kids get the truth in schools. And Mr. Elected, if you have a issue with that, let's talk offline. And you can come visit our school and see what we actually do. I'm HBCU alum as well. I went to Spelman, and it was the first time paying all that money. God bless Spelman and Morehouse, but paying back those loans. It was the first time in school I had a Black teacher. It was the first time in school we read an author that was Black, right? And I left my high school, again, top 2%, like Harvard's coming down to recruit us. We're going to Paris for spring break on school trips, like realizing I got such a narrow view of what it meant to be valuable as a human, and so did my white counterparts, right? And so if we're really in this work about schooling, if we're really in this work about propping kids up and making sure that everyone is valuable, then we should have to tell the truth. And if call it what you're gonna call it, we're gonna call it the truth.
I just remembered another story. and Sekou, I do want to respond to the words that you chose. But here, I remember that when we first got our school authorized, there was a member of the board, the L Unified Board, and let me go to a hard subject here, right? This is a little bit of preaching to the converted here, but let's talk about something that's hard, and especially in Los Angeles, and it came up really hard in the last year in terms of Black versus brown, right? We want Black and brown, but Black versus brown, and the situation with those council members. But in this particular moment about our school is called Academia Avance, right? And this board member, we were just about to be approved, and I remember she pulled down her mic, and she goes, I just have one question. And my question is, I want to know, how do you say the name of your school in English? Okay? And that hit me like a funny bone. It was instant. Right? Now, this was an African-American board member. And I knew exactly where this was going. Right? And because I remember hearing that this board member was who was in a runoff with another African-American board member and was telling folks, oh, you don't want to vote for that one because she works too much with the Latinos, right? You want to work with me, right? And that was immediately I remembered that. So I took a deep breath and I said, thank you for the question. It's Academia Avance, right? And she said, no. I want you to know, I want to know how to say it. Now, she didn't say what does it mean or what's interpretation. She said say. And I said it again. Right? And now you could see everyone in the whole audience was whoa, I don't know what's going to happen here. Right? And three times, right? Now, mind you, we did finally get it approved. But my point is that we got a lot of division, and words make a difference here, right? But Sekou, to your point, with all due respect, let me say, because it seems almost like the one history. I think it's okay to have as many histories as you want. You know what? You got a different interpretation, you write it up. The difference is that our side, the people, are not calling to burn those books, right? They're saying burn Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, but no one's saying get rid of Birth of a Nation. I say, you know what, we need that with the right context. Right? So we need all of those histories, and that's kind of the tradition of this country. You want to write something totally wacko? Go ahead. Now, I mean, Alex Jones and those guys, they need to have some context put on them. They need to have some limits. Fox News, it's a problem, right? But I think what this represents, what technology represents, is you can't singularize this. It's going to be more and more and more, right? Our challenge is to get kids to see, to find the context, and that is our role. Now, that's all this is to say, it's the kids, right? The way through this is the kids, right? And so I'm thinking of think of a place where this CRT stuff is just so out of control from the people that are trying to make it an evil, bad thing. I'll bet you a lot of those, and it's parents, right, and board members and the elected officials, I'll bet you some of those kids actually do want to learn this stuff, right? And you're not going to be able to stop the kids or the way forward if you give them some context, if you let them learn. So it reminded me that last May, we take our students every year on a project. And last year's project was about self-determination, right, and sovereignty, right? We couldn't go to Ukraine to learn about sovereignty, but why don't we go to the Cherokee Nation? So we took our students to Tulsa. And while we were there, let's also go to the Black Wall Street. Let's also go to the Greenwood District, right? And you know that story, right? Which was a secret for so long. But here's the irony that came to me. We were there on Cinco de Mayo, right? So think of Cinco de Mayo in Tulsa, as red as it gets. That's probably as anti-woke, anti-CRT as you could imagine, right? But they closed the downtown street for a Cinco de Mayo festival, right? Because there was a Mexican restaurant there, right? And they closed down, and so this was the city saying, yeah, we condone this. We're into this. Let's have a party. Oh, let's have a party, right? And I was laughing, and the guard guy, they had security there. He kind of saw it, and he goes like, "Yeah, I know, man. Just another excuse for white people to get drunk." And they were really, really getting drunk, right? But they were having fun, right? And so they created a wrestling rink, and they were doing wrestling, right? Dressed as lucha libre. That was the Mexican part. Right, and okay, and they don't actually wear tags, but this was a very LGBTQ. This was a gay event, and that's when I realized in Tulsa, downtown Tulsa, you guys are going to lose, right? Because even that eventually broke through, right? So the kids are going to break through all of this anti-woke stuff. They're going to see right through Ron DeSantis. They're going to leave that state. Mm-hmm. And that's how I think we're going to get through this. Long story.
Wow, yeah, that was a lot to unpack with all of that. and I appreciate you all being honest about it. I mean, this is a congregation of folks that I think we need to be brave and be okay with saying that. I mean, all due respect to the building that we are in, but in order for us to be able to lead in the way that we need to be truthfully, we have to be okay with having those uncomfortable conversations and challenging those words. So I commend all of you on that. I want to shift a little bit to two things. One, I want to talk a little bit about funding of a charter. And I also want to talk about what happens when our schools close. Because I think a lot of times people don't realize that either through a renewal process or trying to open in some cases, we're talking about students who are looking, we're talking about parents who are looking for another option. So can y'all talk, we'll start with what happens when your school is in jeopardy of closing? What happens to those students? What does that look like for those families? Can y'all talk a little bit about that to paint a story and a picture of what we see happening in our communities?
Okay. So at BLACC, we're thinking a lot about this because in New York, the way that the law is written, when a charter school closes, that charter isn't eligible for like a new charter to open, right? So we have this cap. If charter school A closes down, that charter just goes dormant. Like it's not eligible to be reopened by someone else, right? And so we're thinking about how can we get data on the school leaders of schools that have been closed, because anecdotally we believe it is majority school leaders of color, right, that didn't get the capacity building, access to philanthropy in the way that some of the traditional centerpieces of the charter sector in New York, some of the larger CMOs have had, right? And so when we think about schools that have closed, we do see schools that were in neighborhoods who had the highest need in terms of lack of educational opportunities. And you know, as school leaders, we're deeply entrenched in accountability, and this report's due to the state in this portal by this time. All of that's invisible for our parents, right? And so when we have seen schools close, you know, it might be kind of a slow bleed for school administration and for teachers, but it is life-changing for a lot of families, right? And might come out of left field. Like we had a school close in Brooklyn, and they made the announcement maybe 10 weeks before the school year ended, right? And so not only are families scrambling to find a new option in areas that have very few options, those teachers are also branded as not it, right? Like they're very hard to find a job after leaving a school that's closing. And families are just, you know, scrambling to find an option that fits the needs of their child. So it is deeply disruptive and something that we should be thoughtful about when we are thinking about funding and philanthropy. How do we pour resources into schools that might not have access to equitable resources that could impact, you know, their legal right to stay open?
Does anyone else want to add to that? We've got about 10 minutes, and I want to give time for Q&A, so we can move on. I did want to add to your point about closure. Recently, we did a hearing in Philadelphia, and there's a study that came out of the University of Arkansas that mentioned that, and it isolated specifically Black charter schools because of some issues that are happening in Philadelphia, but it said about 31% of the charter schools that typically close are from African-American charter schools and from those communities. So there definitely is a disparity in those that are closed, and as we also know, those that actually get an opportunity to open. The other end of that question is the funding conversation, and I would love to hear from you all, like, just in the sense of like, how have you handled, you know, the funding issue as far as like, what does it take to open a school? What does it take to run a school? What types of capital do you need? Can you speak a little bit to that?
Well, partly because it gives me a chance to put in the message from the Alliance here, right? We're here this week to advocate with the at the federal level for the charter school program, the federal funding, right? We want it increased by 12, 15%, right? So that's what we're trying to do. But the federal funding is, as you all know, is not the biggest component for what it takes to run charter schools, right? There's the state funds, and then there's the non-government funds. But to the question in terms of what happens when you close, right? I just want to extend that, in that one of the ways that they're pushing closure, caps is one, but is changing the renewal laws, the appeal laws, right? And there, Avance knows about that, right? So we started in 2005. They tried to close us in 2008. They failed. 2010, we appealed, we got renewed. 2015, we appealed, and we won. 2020, we appealed, and we won, right? So if you take away the appeal allowance, Avance doesn't exist, but that is what they've started to do in California, and that's percolating. I mentioned it to get to that federal policy. It's state laws that control charter schools for the most part, but the federal laws, I think, kind of set the tone, right? And so we were, many of you here, we were here last May to look at the regulations that were coming through the Department of Education. It's important because what that tone then percolates down to the rest of the states. But we're here today to try to get more funding for the charter school program. It's one small part. Another one, which I think leads to a whole other question, just in terms of declining enrollment. I think some of the biggest challenges throughout the country happen to be regions where there's declining enrollment. I think it's less of an issue where there's growing, there's bigger pie for everybody, but it sooner or later is going to come back. The demographics of this country are that if you look out 10, 15 years, there's less kids, right? And then those less kids are having less kids, right? So we're coming to a big reckoning down the line. But I'll stop there.
We'll have one more comment, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
The funding piece, I think two things that really came up for me was one, looking at compliance and innovation and how they don't get along. And so when we are looking at funding, right, and of course renewing our charter, this is the first time DreamHouse of a Beach is actually gonna go ahead and renew our charter and see where we're at there. But it comes down to the compliances and of course the accountability portion. And so funding facilities, of course, is such a huge issue, especially in Hawaii. Right now, our campus, starting next year, is going to be 3 different sites. And that is because of the system that was designed and the fact that we are also state agency that is a federally funded program. And so, when you look at funding, we have to navigate through using our nonprofit. Our nonprofit board is the one that would have to sign a lease amongst leasers, right? And so when you have programs like the CSP, that really allows us to go after that type of funding. So that way we know that the facilities portion, because philanthropy in Hawaii can also be not as accessible and equitable, that I've learned, to all charter schools. And because we are a small island, everybody's going after the same big fish. And so how do you, right, leverage other partners or other community organizations that will cater and actually focus on one part of your charter school? And that, right now, our main focus is facilities, because that is what it takes to truly, ensure that our charter is successful. Kids need a place. Kids need a home for a learning environment. And so if you as a CEO is not forward thinking, not able to, do your research and the financing portion, and, go after grants that can help expand your charter school, that's really what it's all about. And that's why we also, thank like CSP for allowing for us to get that grant, so that way we can focus on the academic part. We can focus on teacher retention and development, and also continue our expansion to grow.
All right, well, let's give our panelists a huge round of applause. And this is an opportunity. We have about 7 minutes to just get some questions from the audience. This is an educated group of folks, and I know sometimes we like to lead our questions in with a huge statement that lasts about 2 minutes, and then we get to the question. But in the essence of time, I would love for you to just state your name if you have a question, and then let's ask a specific question, and we can share, all those advocacy stories with the folks outside of this room later today and tomorrow. So, does anyone have any questions that they want to pose to the panel or any of us?
Good afternoon, Ricardo, co-founder at Statesman Academy. We all know that in all of our cities and ecosystems, there is the narrative of public versus charter, and a very pervasive narrative that eventually showed up on television this year with Abbott. And so I am wondering how in your ecosystems you all are navigating those conversations, those relationships, and how you're moving and pushing forward. I got a quick answer. Right. Just look at Los Angeles, right? And you can't dispute that public education was in a really bad spot. Let's go back, just to pick a year, 2000, right? It has gotten better. Now, long ways to go. We want it to get better, right? But it has gotten better with both systems. One did not supplant the other, right? It took both systems. We need all kinds of solutions, right? And so I think the other side tries to make it seem like it's all or nothing. Charter schools are trying to get rid of them. No, I don't know, man. Truth, some maybe a little bit, but 99.9% of the charter folk I know are like, hey, do your thing, let us do our thing. And guess what? It is all worked up together, right? But the other side doesn't have that duality.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, I think that there's something to the diversity of what happens in K-12 education in a given community. So, you know, as I grew up here, I think what people have struggled to wrap their heads around is education for kids K-12 in DC is dramatically different today than it was 20 years ago. But 20 years ago was also different than it was the 20 years prior to that. I mean, and it's something really, really simple. Like, there was a much larger subset of the education, essentially, system that was like Catholic schools for low-income children in the district, like when I was growing up. And like almost all those schools are gone. Now, what happened over time was essentially that footprint was reformatted and, you know, recreated by charters. But I think we also just have to remember that, like, there's a need for diversity of offerings, programmatic and otherwise, in K through 12. I mean, I always tell my friends, think about it this way. Like, when people are out there choosing, you know, independent or private schools for their kids, right? Like, they've essentially controlled for quality. Now they're just picking amongst programmatic options. And I think that we actually should set as a goal to have that in public education, right? That we raise the quality floor so that all of it is good, but then we allow for families to say, this is the thing I want for this child, and this is the thing I want for this child, not there's only one thing and we haven't controlled for quality. Because that is where we were. And we're not where we, I think, need to be, but we are, I would argue, like, getting better. And there's at least greater access to quality, like in DC, for instance, now than there was 20 years ago. There's also greater access to diversity of program, which is hugely important.
Yeah, and if I could just put in a shameless plug, because I do run an advocacy organization, I think that one of the things that charter school leaders are getting a lot better at, and we need to continue to do, is to be our own advocates. And so, to give you an example, when one of the things came out of Abbott, one of the series came out, or one of the shows came out, our organization wrote an open letter, and it was just like, just to be responsive, because a lot of times we see that and we're like, all right, what are y'all gonna do about that? Well, what are you gonna do about it? Like, if you are a Philadelphia charter school leader, y'all should be writing letters in all the time, you know what I mean, to Abbott Elementary, because that is based in Philly, talking about Philly schools. Like, so I think from an advocacy standpoint, I would love for us to get out of this space where we want someone else to do that for us and be able to do for ourselves what we know is right and be able to lead that. And there are 4 organizations that are sponsoring this event that are all advocacy organizations that would be there to help you, to guide you through that process. But I think that that is one of the things that makes you guys so great, because we have to step out of the classroom and into the Capitol rooms and have these advocacy conversations around this is not right. And even in these newsrooms, these media rooms, to say that is wrong representation, it is not acceptable, and you need to change your thought.
I just want to add to that, that I think as leaders of color working in our own community, we do have that ground, we have our base, and parents are choosing to come to us. And we have that healthier relationship, right? Just like dating or in a marriage. Either I marry you, or they force me to marry. And I believe in traditional public school, they're forced marriages.
Wow.
Right? Parents really feel, I have to put him there, I have to talk to the high school students, like, I have to come. No, you don't have to. That's the first thing that we tell them in our charter schools. No, you don't have to. You want to be here, it's struggle, it's hard, you will come with a lot of years behind, and we can help you, and we're going to do something because I see you. But that's it. That's all I can do with you. I'm not going to engage in this dysfunctional relationship with you. And with the families that you have to come with. No, you don't. Actually, there's 9 other high schools around me. Pick one. I make them go visit 3 more high schools, and then you tell me you want to come. You tell me you want to come. Because then we have to marry. Versus if I'm going to force him to marry me. I'm not his type. You know, so I think that we have to take advantage of more of that relationship that we have. They choose us. Versus, you know, and the force.
We got time for one more question. Ruben. Okay, before you get your comment, can we get a question then? Does anyone else have one question?
In what ways are you aligned or working with other charters in New York City?
You got my text, all right. I'm going to tell there's a coalition, and some of the folks are here. Every Thursday at 8:30, we meet for 1 hour, right? And it's called Proyecto Ya, right? Project Now. And it started under the pandemic, right? Of like, if we're sitting around waiting for the officials to tell us what's going to happen, we're going to keep waiting, or it's going to be wrong, right? And then when they finally do give you the guidance, but but at the discretion of the local district. In other words, it's all on you, right? Well, then what were we waiting for, right? So I think that, that's an obvious thing. Find your peers, get together, work as a group. And this was the pandemic forced us to do that, right? But in this case, it was charter schools, and we could move fast, right? Ruben told me about, hey, you want an electrostatic sprayer for your disinfectant. I learned it from you, right? And then we were able to get that, and we told 10 other schools, you should try this stuff, and here's a better pricing for it, and don't do that one. So coming together for these kinds of solutions, coming together so that collectively, you might all have the same answer, but to hear each other is synergistic, right? That might be the way to the CRT thing, right? Is let multiple schools and multiple parents get through these kind of thorny, sticky issues.
Ruben, I want to give you a chance to tell your statement, and then Ron, if you want to come up and close us out.
There's the relationship between union and non-union, right? So traditional and charter typically. But like it goes even farther back. I worked in the district for 13 years. Now my career is longer in charter. My wife worked in the district, and then she became a charter teacher. My daughters, we both went to the district schools, right? My daughters only went to charter schools, and now they're charter teachers, right? And yes, I let them do that, and I wanted them to, and I'm happy that they are. But in their education, in their teacher education programs, they're being told by their teacher education folks that charter is bad, right? And then my daughters, even in their undergrad, because they took ed classes, had to stand up and defend charters at the ripe old age of 19, right? In their undergrad, in their graduate programs. And so to me, it goes even farther than just that when we go to job fairs and the district is there, the line for the district is out the door. And there's 40 charter schools, and we're all looking at that line, right? And then we get up and we walk to the line and start talking to the people at the back of the line because they're waiting for 3 hours and we're still there, right? And so there's a publicity piece and a media piece that we just continue to lag because we are decentralized, right? And we are not all the way together. And that's why Proyecto Ya was so important because we were all alone in the pandemic, right? And lots of charter leaders, at least in LA, man, they're like, retirement, I'm out. The pandemic was enough, I'm good. And so there's this effort to cut us up, to put out bad media. Now, I stopped watching Abbott Elementary because of that one. After that, I was done.
I keep watching because they're
Yeah, I hear but they put it out there without, how many people aren't going to see that other piece, right? And so that's why Proyecto Ya really has, honestly, extended my career because I'm tired of the fight every single day. And that coming together there were 30 charter school folks representing more than 30 schools meeting every single Thursday just to talk through the pandemic, right? And so how do we come together? And I came here, like I was a last minute, like, hope I get to go, typed it in, was because I needed to get back out and feel energized again. That there are people and I'm not alone kind of thing.
Well, hopefully this did that for you.
Yeah, but so
And
I think that dichotomy, we have to be aware that it's not just as simple as that. That's the biggest piece, but it goes so far out.
I think that a lot of us learned from the pandemic that community is more valuable for our mental health, for our physical health, in so many ways. And I want to commend Ron Rice, because although we've been doing these charter school leader convenings for 8 years, this is the first year that Ron actually welcomed the Freedom Coalition for Charter Schools. Naomi, stand up please. Naomi Shelton with the National Charter Collaborative. Sonia Park with the Diverse Charter School Coalition. Like, we are national advocacy organizations that heard the call of what you were saying, and were invited to be a part of this. And we just, I told Ron during the lunch break, I was like, that conversation we have with funders, if you want to get 300 people here next time, you keep talking with, advocacy organizations like ours and people like you, and we'll bring them. So with no further ado, I want to bring Ron back up to close us out.
To close this panel and this moderator, I'm going to stand in between two giants here. Thank you all for being here. I just want to thank the panel, and I want to thank the good gentleman from the great state of Oklahoma who reserved this room for us, Congressman Tom Cole. Can we give him a round of applause for that? And so Jay said it best. Ruben, you said it best too, right? We have to start being stronger advocates, and we have to start networking with each other. And my promise and the promise of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools is that we will continue to expand this coalition of leaders of color within the charter school movement across America. We will double, if not triple our size next year, and we will keep the fight going. We are asking for $500 million for the charter schools program for fiscal year 2024 for all the staffers who may be here from various Hill offices, and we're asking for flexibility with those particular dollars. Leaders of color disproportionately rely on CSP because we're the populations that know the least amount of philanthropists or foundation dollars. We don't know rich people. We're community leaders, we're teachers who have an idea and a vision for how we can educate kids better, kids from our own communities. And so CSP is vital for leaders of color who want to start schools and to expand and replicate the schools that they already have in existence. And we're going to need them for the next iteration of charter schools. The schools that may come out of HBCUs through the help of the UNCF will need initial funding to start and then dollars to grow and replicate. The schools started by UNIDOs are going to need dollars to continue to grow and to replicate into the next 21st, further into the 21st century. And so our work is built and conducive to the amount of advocacy we're willing to put not only for our schools, but the schools yet born in our community that the waiting lists across the nation are crying for, that parents are demanding, and that students desperately need. And so we're going to continue this fight. You can applaud that. That's pretty good. You can applaud that. We're going to continue. This video will be sent to members of Congress and to staffers to talk about what we're going to do. But let us ever remember, this is a down payment on the continued growth and advocacy that our schools demand and are going to need from our leaders. And I promise you, this is the first time we work together. Stay tuned for the number of coalition groups that we're going to add to this and increase our numbers. The members of Congress and their staffers here in DC need to know we're here and we ain't going nowhere. In fact, we're gonna be like Bebe's kids. We're gonna grow, we don't die, we're gonna grow and multiply. Thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of your day.